There's a revolt against the Turks. The British have supplied him with guns and gold. But the Arabs are undisciplined. Various tribes and factions argue among themselves. One British officer says the Arabs are just looters and murderers. They would not stand casualties. While a revolt has been declared, no one really knows its strength or how reliable information about it really is.
They interrogated a deserter who had come over from the Ottoman side, a young Arab who claimed to be a representative of Arab secret societies that, according to him, honeycombed the Ottoman armies. Most of the Ottoman troops were, in fact, Arab. And so this young officer said that there was a very good possibility that as much as half or more of the whole Ottoman Empire would switch sides in the war and come over to the Allied side if they felt that the British were going to give Arabs their independence after the war. And what we know now, but they did not know then, was it was a hoax. The young man spoke for nobody but himself.
One fact is clear: the Arab revolt lacks effective leadership. The Arab Bureau in Cairo sends a 28-year-old British captain, Thomas Lawrence, into Arabia to find a man who can bring the tribes together into an effective fighting force. That man turns out to be Prince Faisal, son of Sharif Hussein. Faisal has already joined a secret Arab nationalist society. Lawrence meets him in December 1916, and together, they plan a strategy for attacking the Turks. Lawrence knows the Arab rebels are no good against fortified Turkish positions. He begins to lead small, mobile detachments across the desert on hit-and-run missions. One of his favorite targets is the Hejaz Railway that runs from Medina all the way to Damascus in the north. Lawrence's genius for guerrilla warfare soon emerges. The exploits of this enigmatic soldier and scholar will be popularized 45 years later in the epic Hollywood film, Lawrence of Arabia.
Come on, man!
On July 6, 1917, Lawrence and his Arabs achieve a victory that the British generals in Cairo consider to be impossible. They capture the strategic port of Aqaba on the Red Sea, attacking across 600 miles of desert. Lawrence returns to Cairo to report his victory to General Allenby. Dressed in Arab costume, he creates quite a stir at headquarters. But Allenby has a liking for the unorthodox and appreciates Lawrence's abilities. After the victory in Aqaba, Allenby agrees to supply the Arabs with more guns and more gold. Throughout 1917 and 1918, the Arab revolt plays havoc with the Turkish line of communications, pinning down about 30,000 enemy troops that cannot be used against Allenby. But they stay clear of the fortress at Medina.
The idea of assaulting Medina was not in accord with our best strategy. We wanted the enemy to stay in Medina, and in every other harmless place, in the largest numbers, so long as he gave us the other 999 thousandths of the Arab world.
During the first 3 weeks of May 1918, Arab rebels blow up the Hejaz Railway 25 times. Prince Faisal soon becomes London's favorite Arab leader. By September 1918, General Allenby is ready for his final push toward Damascus. Lawrence and his men destroy 4 miles of Turkish railroad tracks in support of Allenby's advance. The enemy is clearly demoralized and falling apart. The Arab revolt gains more energy as other Arab tribes join Faisal's army. Some of them fight for independence, but most of them fight for the spoils of war. As the official British history notes, they saw their old enemy reeling to destruction. They saw a vision of freedom, and nearer at hand, a vision of loot. At the start of 1918, the British offensive grounds to a halt after the capture of Jerusalem. The Turks have time to gather reinforcements and strengthen their defensive lines. From Germany, an elite fighting unit called the Yildirim, or Lightning Group, has arrived, led by General Erich von Falkenhayn. The fresh German troops joined the attack with machine guns, artillery, and a complement of brand new fighter planes. In Germany, General Hindenburg and his staff have been planning a great offensive on the Western Front. On March 21, 1918, they unleash their mighty attack. Outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, the Allied front collapses. Fearing that the war might be lost, London recalls 90,000 of General Allenby's best men from Palestine, along with heavy artillery, to block the German advance.
Here I have raided the Hejaz Railway, 40 miles east of Jordan, and have done much damage, but my little show dwindles now into a very insufficient affair in comparison with events in Europe.
When Allenby's men arrive in France, they are quickly reminded by their comrades in arms that the real war is in France, not in a far-off desert. Allenby isn't the only general losing troops in Palestine. Enver Pasha has decided to begin a grand offensive in the Caucasus, where the Russian army has disintegrated. He steals some of the best troops from Palestine and doesn't even bother to consult with General von Sanders.
Without giving me a hearing, orders are issued for the withdrawal of my most valuable troops, without which the front cannot be held, and the withdrawal of the remaining German formations, without which the war cannot be continued by Turkey.
Sanders isn't alone in questioning the wisdom of Enver's new campaign. General Kemal also argues that Turkish troops should stay on the Palestine front.
One school of thought exemplified by Mustafa Kemal, who was the philosophical loser in this sense, was that Turkey should tighten up its defenses, should form strategic reserves and get ready for a defensive battle to retain what they had already conquered or held on to in the war. The other strategic idea was Enver Pasha's, and that's that the attack should be continued, that the successes of 1916 should be followed up. There were, in many ways, a small surplus of forces available in 1917.
By the summer of 1918, Turkish troops fighting in Palestine are suffering badly. They have no reserves and few supplies. Their clothes are in rags and they are hobbled by disease. Frequently, the troops aren't even sure if they will have food on the next day.
Hungry, ragged, verminous, comfortless, hopeless, outnumbered. Is it to be wondered that the Turkish soldiers lost heart? It is unlikely that any other troops in the world would have remained without collapse for so long a period of warfare under such conditions.
The German offensive in France is gradually blunted by the Allies. U.S. soldiers have finally arrived in large numbers, and the tide of battle begins to turn. By the fall of 1918, the Germans are the ones retreating. Allenby's forces have been restored, and he strikes the Turks on September 19, 1918, in a series of attacks that will become known as the Battle of Megiddo, the place where, according to the Bible, the final struggle between good and evil will be waged, Armageddon. Covering his right flank with a small mobile force and Lawrence's Arab guerrillas, Allenby sends his cavalry along the coast, where they break the enemy lines and swing to the east. The Turks, threatened with envelopment, retreat northeast in disorder. General von Sanders narrowly avoids being captured. He is reported to retreat in his pajamas. In the chaos that follows, the British take many prisoners. In one incident, 800 Turks surrender to an enemy officer they have just captured. In another incident, an entire regiment of Arab troops drop their guns and leave the field of battle. In the retreat toward Damascus, British planes drop 9 tons of bombs on the enemy. The roads are strewn with dead soldiers, horses, and demolished wagons.
I was more drawn to the idea of learning about people than of killing them. The only thing I killed all the war was a marauding dog, and I feel sorry about that still.
In 2 days, the Turkish 7th and 8th armies are virtually destroyed. The disaster at Megiddo forces the Turkish general staff to realize that the war is lost in Palestine. It is only a matter of time before the Allies fight their way to Istanbul. On February 12, 1918, Enver Pasha sends a Turkish force into eastern Turkey, now void of Russian soldiers. About 20,000 troops of the Armenian National Army, who had fought alongside the Russians, stand in the way. They are well equipped with guns and supplies, but cannot hold out for long against the Turks and begin a fighting retreat toward the Caucasus. Enver's army quickly captures the port of Trabzon and the strategic city of Erzurum, where the Turks had been routed 2 years earlier by the Russians. By the end of April, the Turks control most of the region around Lake Van, including the cities of Van, Bitlis, and Mush. In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm and his generals are suspicious of their allies' advance into the Caucasus, where the rich oil fields of Baku are the great prize. By this time, all the great powers recognize the importance of oil. Short on fuel, Germany has a critical need for the oil in Baku. The Turkish advance must be stopped, and the general staff sends several angry messages to Enver, who ignores all of them. By the end of July, the Ottoman Third Army stands on the heights overlooking Baku. The city is defended by an odd combination of Russian, Armenian, and Muslim forces. The Turks attack several times without success, and then about 2,000 British troops arrive in the city, commanded by General L.C. Dunsterville. London is also concerned about the Turkish advance. They would like to add the oil in Baku to their post-war gains and are willing to fight for it. But the enemy has at least 10 times the number of troops that Dunsterville has cobbled together. Soon, his multinational command begins to fall apart, just as the Turks renew their attack in the middle of September. This time, unlike Gallipoli, the British know when to quit. Dunsterville withdraws his troops into Royal Navy transports that have been waiting at the dock on the Caspian Sea. The British effort to take Baku is short-lived, and after Turkish artillery bombards the remaining defenders, the city falls to Enver's army on September 15, 1918. Without the Russian army to stop them, the Turkish campaign in the Caucasus is a great success. Encouraged by his string of victories, Enver goes on with his plans to unite all the Muslim people in Turkey, Iran, and Central Asia. He now calls his soldiers the Army of Islam, and he leads them farther and farther away from where they are really needed, in Palestine, where the British are scoring their own string of victories. But Enver is caught up in his dream and leads his men forward on a mission that can never be accomplished. 4 years later, the dream ends. With his army of Islam reduced to a handful of followers, Enver is surrounded by Soviet troops in far-off Turkmenistan and killed on August 4th, 1922. In Iraq, things remain fairly quiet after General Maud captures Baghdad in the spring of 1917. Now, a year and a half later, General William Marshall commands the theater when the War Office suddenly orders him to advance northward. London has concluded that the Ottoman Empire is in its death throes and wants to make certain that the large oil reserves around the city of Mosul are in British hands, despite the fact that French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau has been promised the region for France. On October 2, 1918, Marshall receives his orders. Occupy as much of the oil-bearing lands as possible. In a series of attacks, Marshall's troops drive back the enemy along the Tigris River. But the Turks haven't much fight left in them. The Turkish commander is aware that Sultan Mehmed VI is engaged in peace talks with the Allies. He knows the end is near and surrenders his force of 11,000 men on October 30th. The next day, an armistice takes effect and the Ottoman Empire is no longer at war. In violation of that armistice, British troops rush to Mosul and occupy it on November 1st. Great Britain now controls the oil in Iraq. On the Palestine front, Allenby's army and Prince Faisal's men drive into Syria, and Damascus falls on October 1st, 1918. Moving farther north, the British take the city of Aleppo, and the Great Campaign is over, 500 miles from where it started in September. Throughout the fight, the humble heroes of British victory have been the thousands of camels used to carry supplies, and the camel drivers.
You know, the camel, in some respects, saved the British Army. You know, they assembled the largest camel force history has ever known. And of course, it took tens of thousands of camel drivers. But, you know, camels carried the water. They also carried the wounded. Camels could move on sand. And I think the unsung heroes in many respects of the British Army were these camel drivers. They sometimes were recruited by sharp practices. They were sometimes placed under severe discipline. They were supposed to be civilians, but they were basically put under a form of military discipline. And as fast as they were recruited, a lot of them are leaving.
The Turks are in full retreat. General von Sanders and his staff withdraw to Adana in southeastern Turkey. They will fight no more. 5 days later, von Sanders is recalled to Istanbul. He gives a farewell message to his men.
The glorious days of Gallipoli will ever remain unforgotten in the history of all times. I trust that God may grant to the people peace, tranquility, and recovery from the wounds inflicted by the long war.
Sultan Mehmed VI appeals to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson to negotiate a peace agreement with the Allies on behalf of Istanbul. The United States has not declared war on the Ottoman Empire. It has no designs on territory in the Middle East. Wilson refuses to help, and so Istanbul sends another peace envoy, General Charles Townshend, who surrendered his command at Kut al-Amra. After some negotiating, an armistice is signed on board the Royal Navy battleship Agamemnon. In fact, the document is not just a surrender. It gives the Allies permission to occupy any piece of enemy territory they wish. Not only is the Ottoman Empire out of the war, its very existence is threatened. All Turkish territory is placed at the disposal of the Allies for what is diplomatically called further operations of war. Soon after the armistice, Minister of the Interior Talat Pasha, along with Enver and Jamal, make their escape from Istanbul. Power passes to Mehmed VI, who has only been Sultan for 5 months. He wants to keep his new throne and knows he must satisfy the Allies. In France, the German military machine on the Western Front collapses. The German military leaders, who have come so close to victory, now agree to an armistice that begins on November 11th, 1918. All across France, people take to the streets in a cascade of joy that has been suppressed over 4 long years of total, bitter warfare that has taken more than 8 million lives. As Turkish forces lay down their guns all across the empire, the Allies occupy the Dardanelles Straits and the Gallipoli Peninsula. Slowly but surely, the Allies start to devour Turkish land. In the east, Armenian troops march back into Turkey. In the southeast, French and Armenian troops land at Adana. In the southwest, Italian forces establish a foothold. And from the west, a Greek army of occupation lands at the city of Izmir. Most of the Turkish army, nearly 3 million strong, no longer exists. 1 out of every 3 soldiers has been killed or wounded. Hundreds of thousands are prisoners of war or have simply deserted. More than 1 million citizens in the Ottoman Empire have also died. Thousands more are starving or dying of disease. About half the empire's land is now in enemy hands. Unproductive land, and the economy is in ruins. And yet, the Turkish army is not completely destroyed. It still controls a large part of Turkey. A cadre of seasoned and committed officers pull their ranks together. The Western powers are eager to bring even more land under their control. But some Turkish generals think differently, and one of them is about to change the entire future of his country. General Mustafa Kemal, who played a key role in the defense of Gallipoli, has been held back in his career by the jealousy of Enver Pasha.
Enver Pasha was a charismatic young man who wanted to make the Ottoman Empire great. He was aggressive and reckless. Mustafa Kemal, on the other hand, was I think smarter, also a political animal, but was more cautious, was more deliberate in his thinking. Mustafa Kemal, when he arrived at a conclusion, was then ruthless and relentless in his execution. He was a fierce fighter. He was the best commander, certainly in the Ottoman army, and certainly, as Churchill pointed out, one of the best commanders of the whole entire war.
Now, in the spring of 1919, Kemal finally gets his chance. Outside of Istanbul, the social fabric all across Turkey has broken down. It is a lawless land with no central authority. The Sultan is controlled by the Allies, but the Allies no longer have enough troops to maintain security in the Middle East. When civil violence breaks out around the city of Samsun on the Black Sea coast, Kemal is sent there to restore order. He is given broad powers as an inspector general for the army. He arrives in Samsun on May 19, 1919, with a clear mission: galvanize the Turkish nationalist movement into a political reality and raise a new army to drive foreign invaders out of the land. He meets with a small group of like-minded colleagues, and together they draft a Declaration of Independence. Kemal travels from city to city throughout 1919, recruiting support from local leaders, army officers, and the Turkish people. Even the Muslim religious leaders lend their support in the fight to create a new Turkish republic. Entire units of troops regroup and seize the weapons they surrendered only recently. Nationalist leaders converge at the city of Sivas to discuss the future of their country. More leaders meet at the fortress city of Erzurum, where Kemal argues that the Sultan's government is nothing more than a pawn of the Allies. Istanbul no longer represents the best interests of the Turkish nation. The Allies know little about 38-year-old Mustafa Kemal, who suddenly emerges at the head of an all-out revolt against European authority. When Lloyd George makes inquiries about Kemal, neither the Foreign Office nor the Intelligence Service can say much about him. They can't even say whether Kemal is acting for or against the Sultan's government. By the end of 1919, Turkish nationalists, known as Kemalists, come to power in a series of local elections. They converge in Ankara, a city in north-central Turkey. Far from Istanbul, British battleships, and invading armies, it is a good location for a new government, which is proclaimed in April 1920. Kemal and his supporters commit themselves to creating an independent Turkish state, free of Western occupation. A few months later, the Sultan's government signs the Treaty of Sèvres with the Allies. Under its terms, large parts of Turkey will be handed over to France, Italy, Greece, and Armenia. Istanbul and the Dardanelles will fall under international control, with a military presence. Arabia, Iraq, Egypt, and Palestine will belong to London, and Paris will control Syria and Lebanon. The treaty is a public version of a secret agreement made between Britain and France back in 1916. At that time, British diplomat Mark Sykes and French diplomat Francois Picot redrew the map of the Middle East to accommodate Western greed for land and oil.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement was an arrangement between Britain and France, arrived at about midway through the war, as to how the Middle East would be divided in terms of their own interests when the war was over. This was an agreement that it was essential to hold. Sykes felt, and because he had been told that by his friends in the Arab Bureau in Cairo, that it was of greatest importance that the British should know what they could give away to the supposed Arab leader, Sharif Hussein. Before they knew what they could give him, they had to know what they were giving the French.
In Ankara, the Kemalist government immediately rejects the Treaty of Sèvres. But the Allies aren't worried. They hold all the cards, or so they believe. Prince Faisal and his Arab army make their victorious entrance into Damascus on October 3rd, 1918. In return for supporting the Allies, Faisal expects to rule over an independent Arab republic stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, including Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. General Allenby meets with Faisal and Colonel Lawrence, breaking the news that under previous arrangements, France is to rule in Syria and Lebanon, while Britain will take charge in Palestine, where a Jewish homeland will be guaranteed. Predictably, Faisal objects strongly, but to no avail. He is vastly outnumbered. At the Paris Peace Conference, the victorious Allies dictate peace terms to Germany and Austro-Hungary. The Treaty of Versailles is signed on June 28, 1919. During the peace conference, Lloyd George argues that Great Britain should play a dominant role in the Middle East. He reminds the delegates that more than 1 million British soldiers are stationed there, and that 250,000 have died or been wounded there. French losses in the Middle East are far less, and the United States hasn't even fought there. One maxim of military doctrine has never changed. To control an occupied country, a government needs to have enough troops to do the job. 1 million British soldiers can get the job done in the Middle East and maintain order among the civilian populations. But those troops are about to disappear. Many have not been home since 1914, and their attitude is verging on mutiny. General Allenby understands the danger of disgruntled soldiers in foreign lands, and in the spring of 1919, convinces the War Office to bring the boys back home. To fill the void being left by the British, Lloyd George calls on another ally, Greece. In Athens, Prime Minister Eleutherios Venizelos is more than happy to oblige. His government has its eyes on Western Turkey anyway, with plans to make it part of Greece. Sending an army of occupation at London's request will only make the job easier. And the Greeks can also make sure the Italians in southern Turkey don't take more than they've been promised. Prince Faisal, the Arab representative to the Paris Peace Conference, finally agrees to exclude Palestine from a new Arab republic. Chaim Weizmann and other Jewish Zionist leaders are intent on making Palestine a new homeland for their people around the world. Lord A.J. Balfour has written a declaration to that effect. It reads in part,
His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object.
Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the Zionist leader who was responsible for the issuance of this statement, insisted that it be a public engagement. It had to be there on the front page of the newspaper. There was, he correctly saw that only an agreement that was open and public would be considered legitimate in the post-war world. That the very secrecy with which other agreements were made suggested impropriety. And that was a very astute observation of Weizmann's, and it made an enormous difference in the Balfour Declaration.
But Faisal and his Arabs still demand control over Syria and Lebanon. France, intent on dominating both areas, sees Faisal as nothing more than a British puppet, and Arab independence as nothing more than British manipulation. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau is frustrated by the political intrigue, and at one point in the negotiations, bursts into a rage and offers Lloyd George the choice of pistols or swords. Lord Balfour is more cynically detached and describes Wilson, George, and Clemenceau as
three all-powerful, all-ignorant men, sitting there and carving up continents with only a child to lead them.
Lebanon becomes a battleground for French troops, Arab rebels, and British security forces. Arabs attack the French with frequent raids. British forces stop the French from retaliating. Small wonder that Clemenceau has challenged Lloyd George to a duel. Winston Churchill, rehabilitated from his role in the Gallipoli disaster, becomes the government's new Secretary of War in 1919. He warns Parliament not to disband its army too soon, lest the new peace cannot be enforced. Yet by 1920, the British Army in the Middle East has shrunk to about 300,000 men.
There was a British army of about 1 million men in the Middle East. And there was no other organized armed force in the whole of Asia. So Britain was in a position to impose her will, to make any settlement she wanted. But Winston Churchill warned that that situation was, in its nature, a temporary one. That it was very important for Britain to impose her terms before disbanding her armies. Because if she disbanded her armies first, she couldn't get her terms. This advice was unheeded. And Britain did indeed go ahead and dissolve her armies. And the result was that within months after the armistice was signed, you had got one by one disorders and uprisings in every single country of the Middle East.
London and Paris are the only two governments left to settle matters in the Middle East. Italy has dropped out in disgust, and the United States has opted for isolationism. But Lloyd George is undeterred by such realities. He is determined to redraw the map in the Middle East and to add nearly 1 million square miles to the British Empire. In Ankara, General Kemal monitors the land-grabbing frenzy and bides his time. The new Turkish government and its army are about to make a reply. In 1918, after Russian troops have withdrawn, a new Armenian Republic is established in the Caucasus, with its capital in Yerevan. The Armenian government believes that its people have a historical claim to a large region in eastern Turkey. After the Ottoman Empire surrenders to the Allies, Yerevan sends its troops to occupy the area. But the Turkish nationalists also see the region as part of their traditional homeland. In the fall of 1919, Turkish troops commanded by General Kazim Karabakir advance against the Armenians and in a series of battles steadily push them back toward the Caucasus. As the fighting continues for another year, the Western powers change their minds about helping Armenia and withdraw their support. In December 1920, the Armenian government signs a treaty with the Turkish nationalists. The following spring, Ankara signs another treaty with Vladimir Lenin in Moscow, and the eastern borders of Turkey are secured. As for the Armenian Republic, its independence is short-lived. Soviet troops and political commissars take control in Yerevan, and Armenia becomes part of the Soviet Union. It will not achieve independence again until 1991. While they drive Armenians out of the east, Kemalist forces also attack French and Armenian troops that occupy an area in southeastern Turkey known as Cilicia. From February to April of 1920, Turkish forces score several victories. The new French Prime Minister, Alexander Miron, is under pressure to demobilize the French army while still holding on to Syria. He orders his commanders to find a way out and start negotiating with Kemal. Lloyd George, on the other hand, rejects conciliation and sends British troops to occupy Istanbul. Churchill urges him to make peace with Kemal, believing that a solid agreement with Ankara is the best way to stop communist expansion. Meanwhile, the Soviets reach an understanding with the Turks. Moscow fears the growth of British influence in the Middle East, so it decides to support the Kemalist government and begins to funnel money and weapons to the Turkish nationalists. In the spring of 1921, French diplomat Henry Franklin Bouillon goes to Ankara and reaches an accord that ends the conflict in Turkey. Paris formally recognizes the legitimacy of the Ankara government and will no longer deal with the Sultan in Istanbul. The Treaty of Sèvres is canceled, and Lloyd George's carefully drawn map of the Middle East is now a meaningless piece of paper. Britain feels betrayed by this separate peace engineered by the French. London and Paris, two governments that suffered through the Great War together, are no longer allies in the war that continues in the Middle East. By October 1921, all French and Armenian forces are evacuated from Turkey. Now General Kemal and his army can focus on yet another enemy, the Greek army that lies to the west. In mid-June 1920, London approaches Greek Prime Minister Venizelos for help in defeating the Turkish nationalists, who have even begun to attack British troops in Istanbul. The Allies agree to let Greek forces advance from Izmir into Turkey, and on June 22nd, the invasion begins. By the following year, Greek troops have advanced deep into Turkish territory. An exultant Lloyd George proclaims, "Turkey is no more." But the Turks themselves aren't convinced. Kemal plans to use the same strategy employed by the Russians against Napoleon in 1812. Draw the enemy into the interior, wear them down, and then counterattack. Arnold Toynbee, a historian who reports on the campaign for the Manchester Guardian, writes the following.
I began to realize on how narrow a margin the Greeks had gambled for a military decision, and how adverse were the circumstances under which they were playing for victory over Kemal.
At the end of March 1921, the Turks repel 3 strong Greek attacks and hold their ground. In July, King Constantine of Greece takes personal command of his forces in Turkey and strikes in a brilliant attack that drives the enemy back toward Ankara. General Kemal calls his National Assembly into secret session and offers a desperate solution. He asks his government to make him supreme commander with dictatorial powers for 3 months. If he fails to turn back the Greek army, the blame will fall entirely on him. The assembly agrees. Kemal and his second-in-command, Ismet İnönü, pull their troops back to within 50 miles of Ankara and build a strong defensive position along the Sakarya River, with concentric rings of trenches. In late August, Constantine's army attacks again, driving the Turks back at the rate of a mile per day. The two sides fight savagely for weeks. Then Kemal sends his cavalry to attack the exposed Greek supply lines. Constantine fears that his army may be surrounded. With his troops exhausted and his supply base 350 miles away, Constantine decides to fall back. After repelling the enemy tide at the gates of Ankara, the Turkish army takes an entire year preparing for its next move. The Turkish people have been busy making bullets and hand grenades, putting machine guns together, making uniforms and boots, giving up food and other supplies for the army of Kemal. Everyone is mobilized for total war against the Greeks. In late August 1922, Turkish forces begin their counterattack, moving toward Izmir along the railroad line and north toward the city of Bursa. After several days of brutal combat, the Greek army retreats. Athens appeals urgently to Lloyd George for military assistance. But the British Prime Minister can do nothing, replying that he is one of 3 people in London who support the Greek occupation. At Izmir, a fleet of ships hastily assembles to evacuate the defeated Greek army. It has lost 200,000 men since the invasion began. Masses of soldiers, as well as thousands of Greek civilians, are taken aboard a hodgepodge of ships from a variety of countries as the Turkish army continues to advance. In the midst of this chaos, a fire breaks out in the city and quickly spreads. About half of Izmir is destroyed as thousands die in the flames. General Kemal's army enters the ruins of a once beautiful city on September 11th, 1922. But the Greek soldiers are gone. Even as Izmir still smolders, the Turkish commanders prepare to march against the British in Istanbul. An army that London has underestimated since 1914 still poses a threat 8 years later.
They like to attack. The commanders like to attack. They like to encircle their enemies. They use German models. They were thought to be a liability. The British consistently underestimated them. 2 years after Gallipoli in 1917, the British were still underestimating the Turks and unable to batter through the Turkish defenses at Gaza.
As the Turkish army moves closer to Istanbul, the British decide to negotiate after all. General Charles Harrington arranges a truce, and another war against the Turks is averted. General Kemal and his troops march into the capital unopposed. The Turkish people can finally share the joy that was felt in Paris and London 4 years ago. The enemy has finally been driven out. World War I in the Middle East is over. On July 24th, 1923, the great powers sign a treaty with the Turkish government in the Swiss city of Lausanne. Now the borders of Turkey and the government in Ankara are recognized by all of Europe. On October 29, 1923, Mustafa Kemal, who helped to save his nation on the fields of Gallipoli, becomes the first president of the Turkish Republic. After General Allenby conquers Palestine, he sets up a military administration burdened with the task of creating a Jewish homeland there, despite the strong opposition of Arab nationalists. In Iraq, Muslim nationalists declare the independence of the Baghdad and Basra provinces, with Faisal's brother, Abdullah, as their king. British interests focus on Mosul with its rich oil reserves. Although it's mainly populated by Kurds, London works on a plan to make it part of the Iraqi nation. Complicating the matter further is the fact that most of the 2 million Muslims in the region belong to the Shia sect. One British expert, Arnold Wilson, warns that the Shias will never accept domination by the minority Sunni Muslims. Gertrude Bell, another Arab expert, works on a plan to unify the fragmented Muslim cultures of Iraq into a single Iraqi nation. An American missionary warns her,
"You are flying in the face of 4 millenniums of history if you try to draw a line around Iraq and call it a political entity."
By the spring of 1920, Arab raiding parties infest the Iraqi desert. taking British troops hostage and killing them. By mid-August, the Arab rebels declare a provisional government. The Times of London questions the wisdom of spending millions of pounds in Iraq and Iran in support of what it calls the foolish policy of the government in the Middle East.
Churchill's #1 priority was to save money, because he didn't have very much, and to have a strategy which used very little manpower, because he didn't have big armies. And that came first, ahead of everything else. He did not approach the Middle East with an ideological bent. He approached it with a very practical bent. This had been his job. He stood a good chance of succeeding to be prime minister someday, soon, if he made a success of this job. And that's what he was there to do.
In neighboring Iran, central authority has broken down from British, Russian, and Turkish military operations during the war, as well as German political intrigue. In London, Lord Curzon searches for a way to remove British troops from the region and turn the chaotic territory into a self-supporting nation that can defend itself. But Iran looks elsewhere for support. In February 1921, a new government takes over in Tehran. It denounces the British treaty and signs a new one with the Soviet government in Moscow. Iran is depending on the Russians to help them eliminate the British presence. By the end of 1920, nationalist Arabs are rioting in Egypt and Palestine. King Saud of Arabia and Prince Faisal are fighting the British and French with their own armies. Sentiment grows in London that Great Britain should withdraw from the Middle East entirely. The British Foreign Office believes that the new Soviet regime in Moscow is behind much of the unrest. But it is really Great Britain and France, two Western countries trying to impose their rule on a predominantly Muslim world. In early 1921, Churchill takes charge of the government's Middle Eastern policy as colonial secretary. The Arabs want Palestine, but leaders of the Jewish Zionist movement are encouraging Jews around the world to resettle there. Arab landowners fear that they will be pushed out of their land. The Zionists point to the Balfour Declaration of 1917 as a justification from the British government itself for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. In July of 1922, Churchill argues before the House of Commons that Britain must accept a mandate over Palestine from the League of Nations. The measure is adopted, and Britain is committed to ensuring the security of a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. By the end of 1922, the League of Nations has approved a system of mandates that leaves France in charge of Syria and Lebanon, while Great Britain controls Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq. Prince Faisal, driven from Syria by the French, now rules in Iraq under the influence of London. His brother, Prince Abdullah, is chosen by the British to rule the new nation of Jordan, while west of the Jordan River, the Jewish nation is promised a homeland in Palestine. A national homeland for the Kurds never materializes, and they are spread to this day across parts of Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. But British plans go somewhat awry in Arabia. In a 6-year war, from 1919 to 1925, the new kingdom of Saudi Arabia emerges, where huge oil reserves will soon be discovered. In Syria and Lebanon, French General Maxime Weygand and his troops fight against Muslim insurrections for several years. Not until the 1930s will Damascus and Beirut gain real independence. In redrawing the map of the Middle East for the benefit of Western political and economic aims, and in selecting pro-Western leaders to rule Muslims of various cultures and religious beliefs, Europe guarantees that the future of the Middle East will be plagued by civil strife, regional wars, and foreign occupation. The key ingredient for political stability legitimacy has been largely destroyed by a Western fabrication that has virtually ignored the history and traditions of the Middle East.
The decisions that were made in and after the First World War about the Middle East are responsible for the unending strife and conflict there, for it seeming so hopeless. On the other hand, for all we know, if some other settlement had been imposed instead of this one, it might have been worse. I mean, that's one of the things that historians are limited in. We know what happened. We don't know what would have happened if some other decision had been made. We can guess, but we can't know.
By dividing the Arab world between them, and by guaranteeing a Jewish homeland in Palestine, Britain and France actually accelerate the rise of Arab nationalism and all too frequent conflicts in the Middle East. Even decisive wars create as many new problems as they solve old ones. Palestine faces decades of political and social strife as Jewish Zionism fights for a new homeland and Arabs fight back. In 1948, Britain finally gives up on its mandate in Palestine as no solution can be found to satisfy both Jewish and Arab nationalists who are fighting a civil war. The independent state of Israel is declared, and the Israeli Jews wage 4 separate wars against Arab nations over the next 25 years. In between wars, the Jewish nation fights a running battle with a variety of Muslim terrorist groups. By the 1950s, Iraq and Iran nationalized their oil industries, and Egypt takes the Suez Canal from Great Britain. The Middle East becomes a major playing field for Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and Western powers. Both sides compete for influence among the Arab governments.
How is the battle between our country and the Soviet power complex, how is it going in the Middle East?
Well, sir, I'm going to speak quite truthfully and plainly, because I think the American people are entitled to the facts on this situation. I believe that we are rapidly losing the Cold War in the Near East, in the very heart of the Near East, namely the Arab states.
Could you tell us very briefly, if we lost the Near East because of this increasing communist pressure, what would Russia gain and what would we lose?
Well, everyone knows about the oil. The Near Eastern countries, the Arab countries, are producing over 2 million barrels a day of petroleum today. That is more than 25% of what we produce in this country. If we lost it, I suspect it would very shortly mean gasoline rationing and fuel rationing in this country.
In January 1991, the United States and its allies respond to the invasion of oil-rich Kuwait by its bellicose neighbor, Iraq. In a matter of weeks, the coalition built against Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein attacks his army in Kuwait and drives it back toward Baghdad, just as the British had done in World War I. The Gulf War is a one-sided affair, but the job is left undone. Saddam Hussein and his army live to fight another day. Civil violence and foreign invasion still occur all too frequently in the Middle East. Western economies still depend on the region's oil, and Western governments still must deal with the fear that oil supplies may be cut off. Among the Muslim people, from Istanbul to Tehran, anti-Western sentiment has never been greater, and terrorist attacks against the West have become more deadly. The defeat of the Ottoman Empire in 1918 turned out to be a hollow victory for the West. The seeds of discontent planted at the end of World War I have grown into a fearful harvest. As the author David Fromkin has written, the treaty forced upon the Muslim world was indeed a peace to end all peace. And it is peace that remains elusive in the land of blood and oil.